Welcome everyone, good afternoon. My name is, like you heard, I'm Artturi Lehtiö. I work as a researcher at the Finnish security company called F-Secure. Today I'll be talking about an espionage operation that's commonly referred to as the Dukes. If you've heard people talk about APT-29, it's the same thing, so just remember that. But what are the Dukes? Well, this is our graphic designer's opinion on the Dukes. Personally, I think Mikko Hyppönen has a cooler approach. But more seriously, the Dukes are what you might call an advanced threat actor or an advanced persistent threat. They're not, or it's not a malware family. It's not a set of malware families. It's an entity, a who, something that engages in espionage, performs espionage, might use malware for that purposes, but doesn't only use malware. So don't think of it just as a technical tool or a set of technical tools. Although, of course, they do also use a lot of tools. You've probably heard of some of those as well. Things like Mini Duke or Cosmic Duke, for instance. These are tool sets that the Dukes employ in their operations or in their campaigns. But here as well, I purposely talk about tool sets and not malware families, because these tool sets often consist of a wide variety of different types of components, different types of tools, modules, main components. They often contain multiple different types of loaders, for instance. And in the case of the loaders, for instance, there might not be any technical connection between those different loaders, but they are connected in the sense that those loaders are all used with the same main component. They are all used for the same purpose, and that's where the connection comes from. Now, the Dukes employ, in my opinion, or how I distinguish is they use 9 different tool sets. If your marketing department wants, you can probably say it's 20 or even 30 different tool sets, but that just overcomplicates it and makes it even more confusing. So I try to stick to that 9, at least for now. But even with 9 tool sets, that's still a lot to try and understand and remember, try and figure out how are they related, what are the differences, what are the similarities. And it's probably better not to waste too much time trying to figure that out, but what might help is if you think of them as being divided into 3 groups based on the primary purpose of that tool set. So there are a couple of tool sets where the primary purpose is information stealing. They'll have an information stealing malware as the core component, malware that will try and steal usernames, passwords, credentials like that, or it will go after files, document files, PDFs, or it will collect configuration information on the victim computer or usage information, these types of things. There are 3 of these tool sets that the Dukes employ. There's Pinch Duke, Cosmic Duke, and Gemini Duke. Then there's another type or group of tool sets, what I call modular tool sets. By modular, to borrow a technical term, I mean tool sets that dynamically load modules for different purposes. So while the previously mentioned info stealer tool sets, they can be configured with functionality for different types of purposes, for stealing different types of information, the decision on what functionality to use has to be made before the malware is actually deployed, before a victim is infected with it. You can't change your mind afterwards. But for these modular tool sets, the victim will be infected with a core component that doesn't actually do much. What it will do is it will contact the command and control server and ask, what modules should I use or what should I do? And the Dukes may, for instance, say, download this module and give us the results. And that module might simply collect basic information on the operating system and installed AV and configuration, stuff like that. Then the Dukes will look at the results and they'll say, hey, this looks like a workstation. Let's use the module that takes screenshots. Or they may say, hey, this looks like a server. Maybe the administrators logged in recently. Let's use a module that tries to find password hashes in memory. So they can choose it on the fly dynamically. There are 2 of these tool sets, Cozy Duke and Onion Duke. Onion Nuke is a bit of a difficult case because the toolset actually also includes more independent components and independent information stealer, for instance. But most of the components in that toolset as well are designed to work together in a modular fashion. So that's why I still think it counts as a modular toolset. Then the third type is backdoor toolsets. These might be technically simple, they might be technically very advanced, but their use case is quite simple. Their purpose is to allow the attackers to execute commands on the victim. They don't have fancy support for stealing passwords from a specific software or anything like that. They just allow the attackers to execute commands. And these are Miniduke, CDuke, CloudDuke, and HammerDuke. So to put these in perspective, here's a look at the different toolsets on a timeline. And for clarity, at the bottom, you'll see there's 2008, the earliest known activity for any of the toolsets for the Dukes in general. And at the top, you go up to 2015. And so this shows when each of the toolsets have been active. And first, you've got the InfoStealer toolsets, PinchDuke, Gemini Duke, Cosmic Duke. You'll see those were actually the first toolsets that we currently know the Dukes to have started using. And you'll notice that they've since stopped using 2 of those, but Cosmic Duke is actually still being used. And it's been used for 5 years now, or actually more than 5 years. Then next you've got the modular toolsets, Onion Duke, Cozy Duke. And finally the backdoor toolsets. And there's 2 important things to understand from this. The first one is just how long they've been operating, since 2008, for over 7 years. So it's been going on for a very long time. The other thing is that they keep adding new toolsets. They've retired a few of them, but they're actually constantly using more and more different toolsets concurrently at the same time for different purposes, for instance. I'll get into that more a bit later, but it's important to see how the different toolsets are used concurrently, not just one replacing the other. So what makes all of these toolsets, or what connects all these toolsets? Why are they Duke toolsets? What makes them all Dukes? Well, there's a couple of things. Things like shared loaders, where they might actually, multiple toolsets might employ the same loader. They'll usually have other loaders as well. But for instance, you may have heard of the Miniduke loader or the Miniduke stage 3 loader. That's been used by Miniduke, but it's also been used with PinchDuke and Cosmic Duke. In fact, it's also been used in some cases to open the available hacking tools that the Dukes have been using in some of their campaigns. Then there's shared implementation details. I don't mean shared source code. They haven't, or that hasn't happened between the toolsets except in very specific cases. But what I mean is things like the technique used for gaining persistence on a victim machine, for instance, where that specific technique will be implemented in multiple different toolsets. It will be slightly different to work for that toolset, but the technique is always the same. Or they'll use a specific technique for gathering passwords from a specific piece of software, and again, that technique will be shared between multiple toolsets because they found it to be a working technique. Then there's cases where one toolset is used to infect the victim with another toolset. So for instance, Cosmic Duke has sometimes embedded PinchDuke or Gemini Duke or Miniduke. And in those cases, the victim has been infected with both immediately. Then there's other cases where the victim has first been infected with one toolset, and then the command and control server has instructed the malware at some point to download and install another toolset, or a tool from another toolset, like Cozy Duke has been seen reinfecting its victims with Onion Duke or CDuke or HammerDuke. And finally, there's shared infrastructure, command and control infrastructure, where there are cases where the same server at the same time has been acting as a command and control server for multiple different toolsets. Or in other cases, a server has been used by one toolset and then switched to being used by another toolset. Or cases where they've registered a set of domains And one of those domains has been used for Miniduke command and control. One has been used for Onion Duke, one for Cozy Duke, one for Gemini Duke, and so on. But that's the tool side, infrastructure side. What about the tactics? Because, at least in my opinion, the tools used by the Dukes, they aren't super advanced or super sophisticated. There are a lot of advanced threat actors out there who have much more advanced tools at their disposal. The Dukes don't have rootkits, or at least they haven't used them ever. They haven't been seen using their own exploit kit, or they haven't written their own zero-day exploits. So it can't be that makes them so advanced. What makes them very interesting, at least, is the tactics they employ, which in some cases are a bit unusual or uncommon. But if you start to think about it, there may actually be a surprising amount of logic to that, and a surprising amount of thinking going on behind those tactics. So what kinds of tactics? Well, advanced threat actors, usually they'll try and stay quiet and stealthy and try and stay unnoticed so that they don't get caught. And they'll start by doing some quiet reconnaissance, figure out who they should target, and then they'll quietly start going after that target. Well, the Dukes will often do the opposite. They'll try to infect a huge amount of victims in a short period of time in the hopes that they'll be able to compromise at least a few of those. Once they succeed, they'll very quickly try and gather as much data, possibly interesting data, that they can. They won't use keywords to find the interesting files. They'll just find all the files of that file type, and they'll exfiltrate all of that, but do it in a fast manner. Similarly, they'll try and find all of the usernames, passwords on the system. They'll also quickly try and enumerate the network or the local network of the organization, gather as much information as possible in a way that is bound to be noisy and will probably get noticed at least by someone. But what they'll also do is, if they then realize that this is an interesting target, a target where they'd actually like to stay longer, they'll switch tactics on the fly. And sometimes in quite a literal sense, because they'll actually switch malware toolsets as well. So again, there might be a case where the victim was originally infected with Cozy Duke, and then they'll actually instruct Cozy Duke to download and infect CDuke, for instance, and then they'll remove Cozy Duke from the system. So by the time the incident response team realizes there's been something suspicious going on and we should start investigating, then they maybe find the infection vector. They maybe even find the original malware. They'll start looking for that on their systems, but they won't find that anymore because they've already switched malware. But they do also do highly targeted attacks, interleaved between these. Again, maybe it's the smash and grab is their version of reconnaissance. They gather as much data as they can, they work through that data, figure out who are the people that actually hold the keys to the organization, who actually hold the valuable data, and then they'll go after those people in highly targeted attacks with very specific tools. And again, they'll use different tool sets for these highly targeted attacks, different from the ones they've been using for the smash and grab operations. And in these highly targeted attacks, one thing they also do sometimes is use stolen decoys, where, let's say, they found a document that lists participants for a military exercise that's coming up. They'll steal that document, and then they'll draft an email to military officials that they think might be involved in that exercise, might be attending or organizing it. And then they'll send something like, hey, here's the updated participant list for the exercise that's coming next week. And if the person opens the file, what they'll see is a document containing valid information on participants to that exercise. So they use stolen decoys for things like that. Another thing they do is they use 1-days. Like I said, I'm not aware of them ever using 0 days. I don't think they actually have the skills to find and write 0-day exploits. But what we've seen them do multiple times is cases where some 0-day has been found exploited in the wild by a totally unrelated group. And the vendor will be alerted and someone will post an alert or a warning or a short blog post about it saying, hey, watch out, this software is being exploited in the wild with 0 day. And 7 or 8 days later, the Dukes are suddenly exploiting that same vulnerability. They're not using the same exact exploit in the sense that they found the sample and copied it or patched it, but it seems they've obtained the actual source to the exploit. They've recompiled it in some cases, or they've done slight modifications to it. And it seems like someone has found a 0 day, they've written an exploit, they've sold it to someone who paid enough, it's been used exclusively. Then when it's discovered, that original seller will start to quickly resell it to other customers, probably cheaper, probably to more customers at the same time. And that's when the Dukes will jump in and then they'll buy it. But again, maybe they're aware that the organizations they're targeting, things like large governmental organizations, it's unlikely that from the time the vendor is first notified to a patch being deployed throughout the entire organization, that's going to happen in 7 or 8 days. So essentially what they have is a cheap 0 day that they can start using. So again, I think that's a smart tactic. I don't know, maybe it's just that they don't have the money for real 0 days, but to me it seems like maybe they're saving where there's no chance to save money. And also something that's important to remember when talking about so-called advanced threat actors, it's not just about malware. So in the case of the Dukes as well, they'll use malware when they initially penetrate the organization, when they compromise those initial victims. They may even switch to a second tool set on that same victim. But usually once they start pivoting inside that organization, trying to penetrate deeper, they don't deploy any malware anymore. They know people are going to start looking for malware on all of the systems. What they'll do is they'll try and steal credentials, usernames, passwords. Then they'll use techniques like pass the hash, or if they manage to get plain text credentials, they'll log in via remote desktop protocol, RDP, or something common like that. And what they'll then do to automate their activities is use common administrative tools like PowerShell or Bat scripts, things that most, at least Windows-based organizations, would be running on their Windows endpoints. And if they're going after Windows workstations, well, then it's a lot less suspicious than deploying new malware everywhere. But what about then on the infrastructure side? Again, the command and control infrastructure. In the old days, years ago, the Dukes would use the same command and control server for years on end. And there have been cases documented before by researchers where they were able to get a forensic image of those servers, and they were able to find logs going back, a year or two, looking at old victims, old operations, old activity. These days, the Dukes are starting to get a lot smarter than that. In fact, these days, they have a very fast churn rate on the command and control servers that they use. They'll set up command and control servers. They'll use those against a small group of targets for a small period of time, and then they'll dump them. They'll take the interesting information, clean that up, and they'll leave the command and control server there. And by the time researchers or law enforcement manage to get a forensic image, for instance, there's only old stuff there, and they can see that, well, yeah, it was used as a command and control server, but there's no interesting information here, and the guys don't seem to be coming back. Another thing that they've done before is use domain names, where the same domain name might be used by the same tool set for multiple years, even though it sometimes would direct to different servers. Again, domain names are easy to track, and it's easy to go back in time and look see where those domains are pointed over time. And probably that's the reason why these days the Dukes are simply using direct IP addresses. Or most of the time at least, they'll use direct IP addresses instead of domain names. But naturally, this means they need more command and control servers. And so they've also started using compromised servers, where before they'd rent a VPS or something, use that as the command and control server. These days it seems they have automation for scanning the internet for servers running vulnerable versions of software or services and automatically exploiting those using those as command and control servers. And they're getting very efficient at that as well. And that's how they're able to keep up with the use of the command and control servers for such a short time. And while that makes it harder for things like just simply blocking IP addresses and domain names that we know they've been using, since those are already old and not being used anymore, well, the next thing defenders will start doing is trying to look for patterns in the traffic, trying to detect the traffic. Well, they've also started using SSL, encrypting all of the traffic. So again, it's a lot harder to see or to notice the suspicious activity. And they've even taken this a step further, where they're starting to use third-party services for command and control. Things like Twitter, for instance, or Microsoft OneDrive, where if it's encrypted and it's going to Twitter, how do you know it's not just your users? How do you know it's the malware? Or once the Dukes decide what files they want to steal, or they've decided they want to steal all the document files and all the PDFs, it's going to be suspicious if they suddenly upload large amounts of data to an unknown server. But if they upload it to Microsoft OneDrive, then that's going to look a lot less suspicious, and in many organizations that might even be normal. How many users use it at least secretly if it's not allowed in the organization? But then I keep saying it's an espionage operation. What makes it espionage? What are the targets? What are the Dukes actually after? Before I go further, a short disclaimer. When I talk about targets, I don't imply anything about victims. The fact that a specific government, ministry, or organization was interesting to the Dukes and was targeted by them doesn't mean they were actually a victim or that they were compromised. So, common types of targets for the Dukes. Things like government ministries, ministries of foreign affairs, ministries of defense. Parliaments and senates have been very popular as well. Embassies, but also governmental agencies involved in international cooperation. Agencies that do the actual work of figuring out how to send funds to other nations to help them build infrastructure, for instance. Agencies that are essentially tools of a country's foreign policy, and therefore very interesting if you're trying to track a country's foreign policy decisions and how they're actually doing their foreign policy. Another thing is think tanks. Again, mainly foreign policy-oriented think tanks. Probably unsurprisingly, anything related to NATO. That's usually interesting. And sometimes other organizations that are affiliated or closely associated with the government. Again, commonly organizations that would be involved in foreign policy. Maybe they might hear something interesting, or maybe they're just a good way of getting into those more interesting governmental organizations or targets. And these targets are also geographically dispersed. The Dukes are essentially interested in everyone, or almost everyone. Europe probably isn't a big surprise, or the fact that Eastern Europe is a special area of interest. Also, Central Asia, Caucasus, Turkey. Georgia is a recurring theme. But also Asia and Africa. Similar organizations, again, ministries of foreign affairs, for instance, for Asian and African countries. Also Americas, and again, not just the US, but other countries on that side of the pond as well. So, I'll show you just a couple of examples of these targets, so you get an idea. First one goes back to April 5th, 2009. President Obama, recently appointed president of USA, was delivering a speech in Prague. And one of the subjects he touched upon was the missile defense system that the US was planning on deploying to Europe. A system where radars would be deployed to the Czech Republic and missiles would be deployed to Poland. Some of you probably remember this back then. Well, what have you 11 days later? An interesting, coincidental almost, happening of a couple of pinch duke campaigns or spear phishing with exploit documents with pinch duke as the payload. And the targets just happened to be Poland, Czech Republic, and a US foreign policy think tank. Now, I don't know, maybe it's a coincidence, maybe not. I'll leave that up to you. But what's also important to take away from this is this was already 2009. And already back then they were going after these types of targets. Western countries, even the US, they were also going after participants of NATO exercises. They were going after ministries of foreign affairs, for instance, in Africa, for instance, in Central Asia. So already back then, it was a very, it was a large operation, but also the targets were high profile and high value. It wasn't just a small chop shop operation fish. Now, fast forward, there's a lot of activity in between as well, but then we get to 2014. And by this time, like you may remember, they've already got a lot more tool sets. Their activity has started to evolve. And there's this interesting video, an advertisement from an old Super Bowl that purports to show monkeys, or I was once told I'm incorrect, it's actually chimpanzees at the office. That video was used as a decoy in one of the attacks by the Dukes in July 2014, where they initiated one of the smash and grab operations where they targeted a large amount of targets with spearfishing containing Cozy Duke. And that video was one of the decoys back then. And then this was July 2014. Bit over half a year later, February 2015, again, very similar types of targets, a large amount of targets, similar methods, and the same tool set. And they were again going for a smash and grab. Then half a year later, again, July 2015, very similar spearfishing emails, similar targets, similar tactics. They'd switched malware this time. They were using Cloud Duke instead of Cozy Duke. But it gets even more interesting. In this case, a lot of people were already looking at the Dukes and tracking them, tracking a lot of their operations. In July of 2015, the attacks actually, you could divide it into two waves. There was an initial wave of Cloud Duke in the beginning of July. Then on the 14th of July, Palo Alto publishes a blog post where they describe that malware. It's a very nice blog post, and they go into quite a lot of details, provide hashes, provide domains, IPs, all the IOCs you'd expect, describe how the malware operates, what it's used for. 2 days later, Kaspersky follows up with a couple more details that Palo Alto didn't mention. And then, I believe it was 4 days after Kaspersky's blog post, there's a second wave of Cloud Duke. They're still using the same malware. They haven't made any changes to the malware. They're still using similar spearfishing. They did make a small change. In the first wave, you'd get a spearfish that would lead you to a downloader. That downloader would download a loader, which would load the backdoor. Then they switched to the spearfish leading to the exact same loader that would load the exact same backdoor. So they dropped out the downloader. But other than that, it's an identical operation. This is after, a couple of days after, blog posts had been published about the stuff, which I believe even generated news in the media, not just researchers reading them. And still the guys go forward with the stuff. And what's even more interesting is this is one of the decoys in the second wave. This PDF, the exact same file, same hash, everything, it was also used as a decoy once before in July 2014 with Cozy Duke. So they're using the exact same decoy as well, just a year later. This is another thing that I think is unusual and that tells quite a lot about the Dukes. The fact that even when people know to be looking for them, and they know everyone's looking for them, they don't seem to care. I don't know if it's confidence or they're just so bold. Maybe they don't care about getting noticed or getting caught. Or maybe they're so confident in the fact that the organizations they're targeting are unable to react in time, and they're still able to compromise those organizations. If they've spent a couple of months planning these operations, setting it up, and they're confident it's still going to work, then why stop? In these cases, for instance, with CloudDuke, they used some OneDrive accounts, for instance, in that, and when we went back to Microsoft and asked, Microsoft said they were registered back last spring. So they already had those set up a long time ago, and they were preparing and planning this operation. So they went forward with it, regardless of the fact that everyone was already looking for them. Now, we get into what everyone likes to get into, which is attribution. There's a lot more about this in a white paper we recently did, but since someone's going to ask anyway, I'll go over it quickly. The way I approached attribution, since it's a known very difficult problem, is I divided it into two sub-questions or sub-problems. The first one is it state-sponsored, and in what way? Well, they consistently target entities that are relevant for security policy and foreign policy, and not really anything else, which suggests that the main benefactor is a government or someone who's able to benefit from this type of information. They continue their operations rather than going back into the shadows. So clearly, they're generating enough value for their benefactors to keep going. There's a high level of coordination in the operations. There's no overlap in targeting, for instance. There's no, crashing into each other on the same victims. So it's an organized operation, organized group. And they don't seem to fear repercussions. They don't seem to fear getting caught. They've been talked about, blogged about, written about for 2 years now, 2.5 years actually. And they still keep going, keep expanding their operations, in fact. So they seem to have some kind of protection. My guess is the country where they operate, they have protection from the government, essentially immunity, because it's clearly illegal what they're doing. So to me, that suggests they're working within the government or directly for a government, which leads to the more interesting question of which government. Well, I'll only list the facts here, but there's a lot of Russian language artifacts. Error messages in Russian, for instance, or they've been using Russian language resources, Russian language code pages. Of course, all of that can be faked. Most of the language in the malware is English. It's not perfectly written, but it's quite good English. So could be anyone, and you can probably ask your friend to translate into Russian if you want to leave a false flag there. But there's also interesting artifacts where, for instance, cases where they'll use a timestamp as a mutex name, and that timestamp is within a few seconds of the compilation timestamp after you correct for a time zone, which suggests that it's actually generated at compile time, some preprocessor directive or something like that. And if you look at the time zone, or the time difference between the compilation timestamp, which is UTC-0, and you look at the timestamp used in the mutexes, it follows Moscow Standard Time, even the daylight saving time. Although Russia has made it difficult to follow Moscow Standard Time because they keep changing the daylight saving time, and it seems at some point they stopped updating their compilation machine or compilation server because they kept using the old version. And when we asked Microsoft about that, you needed to install a special update to get the new daylight saving time. So maybe they were lazy. Again, Moscow Standard Time is adhered to in many places, not just in Russia. And then there's compilation timestamps. A lot of other researchers have looked into those, looked at how those correlate with working hours in different areas of the world, or presumed working hours. And again, it seems to suggest that the people writing or compiling the malware are working within the Moscow Standard Time zone. And then a difficult last point. All of the known targets align with what could be expected to be of interest to Russia. Of course, there are targets that would be of interest to a lot of other countries or other people as well. Foreign policy is a global problem for anyone. But again, draw your own conclusions. Finally, a couple of takeaways, things that I think would be, or I'd like you to remember from this talk. Think of the dukes think about it as a single large entity. Don't try and think about Mini Duke or Cosmic Duke or Onion Duke. Don't think about the individual tool sets. You're limiting yourself when you start doing that. If you work in defense, you're an incident responder, for instance, an incident handler. If you see one of the tool sets, start looking for the others as well, because chances are they've switched already. And again, you won't find anything if you start looking just for the first one you saw. But also, don't just look for malware, look for other suspicious activity as well. If you're only looking for endpoints with suspicious executables on them, then again, you're going to miss a lot of this. And if you don't switch credentials at the same time, they'll just keep logging in and dumping more credentials, stealing more data. Something that Brian Carney brought up in his proactive threat hunting as well. And also, don't rely solely on the network level. It's easy to scale network-based detections, or it's easy to have a feed of known command and control domains and IP addresses and keep blocking those. But like I've said, they switch command and control servers so fast you're unlikely to be able to keep up with them, at least all of the different servers they're using. And they're using encryption, they're using common third-party services as command and control channels, so you aren't going to see any suspicious traffic, and you probably aren't going to be blocking Twitter. And final point, or maybe a statement, if we go back to this timeline, other thing I'd like to point out is first public mention of the Dukes was in early 2013, white paper by Kaspersky about Mini Duke. As you can see, most of what we now know about their operations happened before that. It doesn't mean we weren't actually aware of the malware. In fact, quite the opposite. Early 2009, a pinch Duke sample was used in the AV test March 2009 sample set. So we clearly knew about the malware itself, but what we didn't know was the big picture. We didn't understand the context. We didn't know what they were doing, why they were doing, who was doing. We just knew the tools. And I think this is an example again of if you focus too much on the tools themselves, you're going to miss out on a lot. And in my opinion, the only real way to start defending against these types of actors, start understanding them, is to try and look at the bigger picture, understand the context, understand the people behind the tools, and not just the tools. In any case, there's a huge amount of interesting details I didn't have time to cover. There's a recent white paper I wrote. There's a link. Do go read if you're interested. And even if you aren't interested in what I cover in the white paper, it also contains a lot of links to research from a lot of other researchers, other companies. Or if you're interested in tools, there's a short tools section where I don't get into that many details, but there's a lot of links to resources from others. So hopefully it will help you find the information you're actually interested in and actually looking for. So that's about it. I think we have time for questions, and thank you.
Yes, we have 4 minutes for questions.
Could you repeat here?
The question was about Cosmo.
I was going to bring that up, but I wouldn't have had time. So back when we first published a white paper about Cosmic, we said that it's based on an older information stealer called Cosmo. I went digging into that because it bothered me. And I noticed we have detections for 30 different Cosmo variants. And once you start looking for Cosmo detections from other companies, you start running into hundreds or possibly thousands. And if you start comparing those, it seems that Cosmo is a name that's used to detect a huge amount of different stuff. So to me, it doesn't really mean anything. What it did lead to was there were some of the earliest Cosmic samples were being detected as Cosmo by multiple vendors, and some of the old pinch Duke samples were being detected by multiple vendors as Cosmo. So in the context of the Dukes, Cosmo means old Cosmic Duke or late pinch Duke.
In your opinion, how many gangs like this are there actively operating around the world with this level of sophistication?
Well, that's kind of an impossible question, but the Dukes are definitely not the only one. If you look at different countries, different groups, they all have unique ways of doing it. Some operate with multiple small groups aiming toward a common goal. Maybe the coordination is coming from somewhere else. In the case of the Dukes, it seems to be a very large conglomerate of activity working in a very coordinated fashion. There are lots of similar types of groups with similar interests from multiple countries. There are also similar groups coming from the same geographical direction as the Dukes are probably coming from, but again, and like I said, you can classify even this into 20 or 30 toolsets, so it depends on how you...
So do you think there's 30 groups like this or 300?
Well, I guess we're talking in the tens if we're talking about nation states with the resources for this type of stuff, and it is a nation state type of operation. So I'd say I'd be surprised if all of those states are running more than 10 similar groups. So maybe under 100 is a careful guess.
So how effective are they?
Well, they've been doing this for over 7 years. Despite the fact that everyone's been talking about them and they've only gotten more bold and more brazen, so they have to be producing a lot of value for money for someone to want to keep them doing this for such a long time. My guess is if they were just a criminal gang somewhere or if they were bad at their job, they'd have been fired or sent to prison already.
Did you ever obtain any access to any like data or metrics that suggest how much stuff they actually exfiltrated, or?
I haven't seen any specific statistics on that. Based on talking to or coordinating with a lot of organizations that be interested in this, my hunch is there's a lot of people who have been hit by this, but no one's telling even me about that, so it's a hunch.
And what is their objective? Only information stealing, or maybe also altering the information?
Good question. I'm not aware of them altering information, and for the tools that have specific functionality for stealing information, there is no functionality for modifying it. So I'm not aware of that. Of course, it's technically possible with their backdoors and with the modular architecture, but no, I haven't heard of them doing that or seen them do that. Thank you.